Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. My name is Chris Fortier. I'm the Chief Pharmacy Officer at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. Happy to be here today and to be with all of you. Today, I'm going to be talking about the specifically Mass General's journey around realizing the autonomous pharmacy vision. When we think about hospital pharmacy, really a ton hasn't necessarily changed over the last 25 years. We've renovated, we've added new technologies, but we're still really struggling with handling inventory, preparing of medications, as well as distribution and storage of medications. And so as we think about where we're headed and how we can sort of get to the next level, that's really where the autonomous pharmacy journey begins. So I want you to think about what it could be. And one of the things that my organization has thought about a couple years back, and fortunately are now able to partner with our vendor Omnicell on this, is ultimately the autonomous pharmacy vision. And so I liken it to the fact that sort of like air traffic control, right? How can I have automation and pharmacy technicians running the operation with sort of pharmacists or other leaders sort of sitting back in air traffic control, having all the information at their fingertips to direct the preparation, the inventory management, the dispensing of medications. And, again, think about in the United States, we have NASA, right? All this information ultimately at our fingertips to basically make the best decisions moving forward. But obviously we're not there yet. A lot of technologies haven't been created yet to get us to this full point. But ultimately, we need to have sort of the strategic vision and the strategic plan ultimately to get there. So in terms of my session today, I'm going to talk in a couple of different areas, mainly to my organization's journey to this autonomous pharmacy goal. So I'll start with a little bit of background about Massachusetts General Hospital. I'll talk about our start around the autonomous pharmacy journey and what we've done. Talk a little bit about our current state, what technologies we are utilizing, how we're utilizing, where we're utilizing them, and a little bit of a gap assessment, right? Where have we been? Where are we on the journey in terms of where we are doing pretty well, but also where we have some opportunity. We'll talk about some of the challenges and how we can be thinking about those proactively, whether it be organization-wide or specific within the pharmacy department. How can we potentially overcome those challenges? And then finally, I always believe in my presentations, I want the audience to have the opportunity to really get some practical tips that they can take back to their organizations pretty quickly to then implement and utilize. I'd also say if you do have questions today, feel free to use the chat function in Zoom. I'll be answering those at the end of the session today. So let's just start with a little bit of background about my hospital, Massachusetts General Hospital. As I said earlier, we are located in Boston, Massachusetts. We are established back in the early 1800s and ultimately a 1,000-bed academic medical center. We've this year and last year received two really prestigious rankings, number 6 in the US and number 3 hospital in the world, both by Newsweek and US News, that we're very proud of. We are a very large research-based organization. We conduct the largest hospital-based research program in the country. Being the geographic location to Harvard Medical School, we do have the largest teaching hospital of all the Harvard Medical School's affiliations. Now, the picture that you see here, I'll talk a little about in a minute. This is two new towers that we'll be adding on our main campus that'll add another 500 beds to our institution. And I'll talk about how we're sort of utilizing this sort of clean slate to implement some new technologies that may not have been developed yet, and how we really create that hospital pharmacy of the future. So let's talk about our journey and where we've come and where we're going. As I said a little bit earlier, my vision has always been, how do we get our pharmacists ultimately outside of the inpatient pharmacy? We need them on the floors They're strong. They have strong clinical training. We need them to be working with physicians and nurses and patients to best manage their medications. And then ultimately, how do we use automation and some technical staff to run that inpatient pharmacy operation as efficiently as possible, right? So that is has been my ultimate vision for a long time. And as I said, being that Omnicell has come out with sort of their own goal in this space, it really made for a pretty strong partnership to move down the line together in this framework. Now, let me first say, this isn't just, well, I have this great vision and I want to get there, but there's much more to this if we can achieve this from an outcome standpoint. So as I said earlier, really want our pharmacists in clinical roles. Our patients, our physicians need them on the floors as much as possible, managing that complex therapeutics. Number two, like anything, how do we continue to improve medication safety, right? We want to get to zero errors. It's not easy, but utilizing technology hopefully can get us there and make us safer. I think, like with anything, how can we be more efficient, right? How can we use technology to be more efficient in our day? Can we redeploy people to other areas because technology ultimately is making us more efficient, or can take over some of that workload in other areas? Reduce costs, enhance revenue. As we know, that's always an important component. And even though we may be thinking about technology around drug preparation or dispensing, we also need to think about things like analytics and finances, and how do we ensure, for instance, we're charging appropriately or purchasing the product at the right price. So it's more than just the patient care aspect that we need to be thinking about. Regulatory compliance continues to be an ongoing struggle in terms of how the regulations continue to change, and how can we use technology and automation to make that a little bit more, to make it stronger for us to be in compliance and a little bit easier overall. And then finally, ultimately, like anything, we want to continue to take things to the next level. How do we ultimately continue to move forward in the changing healthcare environment, in the changing pharmacy profession? And this is one way potentially to get there from a strategic perspective. So I want to just talk through a little bit of the technologies that we currently have in our organization, and I'm going to talk about them in the order of how we've implemented them in our organization over the past many years. You can see the large cabinet here on the left side of the screen. These are Omnicell XT cabinets. Omnicell has been a long-standing partner with cabinets. That was the first product they came out with. And we have about 200 of these in our organization. We actually just upgraded or are upgrading to these new cabinets that have some new functionality and more efficient storage of medications. But really for us in the US, cabinets are critically important. We want medications as close to the patient's bedside as possible. We necessarily can't have them in the room, but we want them on every unit, or sometimes multiple on each unit, so that our nurses can pull medications from them, obviously scan them as they're administering them to the patient. So again, we have about 200 of these throughout both the inpatient as well as the outpatient settings within our organization to best manage medications. And of course, having them in these cabinets, we can see who's entering the system, how many products, what products do we have and what's running low. It just makes for a much more efficient process. It ensures a lot of med safety, to be quite honest, as well as regulatory compliance with the storage of medications. The next product that we had implemented is the bottom here, is an anesthesia workstation. Works very much like a larger cabinet, but specifically designed for the operating room for anesthesiologists to utilize. As you may know, we're using, there's organizations that use a lot of kits and that don't necessarily have automation. It just makes for a very difficult process to keep track of, again, who's utilizing it, how much do you have, how much do you need to refill. And so each of these are at ultimately the head of the table that the patient is on, that the anesthesiologist works from. And it's connected both with our electronic health record and through Omnicell. And so we know what was taken out, and we can track what ultimately was documented in the electronic health record. So again, with a lot of narcotics and other sort of high use medications, an anesthesia workstation really makes our process much more efficient and compliant, and again, improves med safety. The top picture here are medication carousels. We have 5 of these in our inpatient pharmacy. We have 1 of them in our operating room pharmacy as well. And the whole premise of carousels for us has been about better storage of, more efficient storage of medications, as well as managing a perpetual inventory. We're scanning product in as we load it, and we're scanning product out as we pull them to then dispense up to the floor into the cabinets. And so again, we have those checks and balances. We can manage inventory. We're ensuring we're pulling the right product to be delivered to the floor from a med safety standpoint. So again, we have 5 of these in our inpatient pharmacy just due to the volume of medications that we have in our institution. It works very efficiently for us. This cabinet over here that you can't really see any drugs to the far right is around controlled substances. And along with that goes a system called Controlled Substance Manager. And so we needed to have some software in place and cabinets to store our narcotics, our controlled substances. We do have what we call a narcotic vault in our inpatient pharmacy. It's basically a separated area that has multiple cabinets where we store these medications, and again, can determine who's going in, what's being pulled out, what's still in the cabinet. And as you obviously know, the perpetual inventory of controlled substances is even more critical just due to the potential diversion of those products. And so we used to just have all open shelving. We didn't know what we ultimately had other than what was recorded on a paper binder. And so now we have really a closed loop system. We know what is in the system. We know what is up in our cabinets. We know when products are pulled out, they are assigned to a specific cabinet, and we know what ultimately was dispensed to that cabinet. So if 10 oxycodone were pulled out, the system allows us to confirm that on unit A, that 10 of those oxycodones were ultimately loaded into the cabinet. And again, that closed loop, as well as when products expire and they're returned, what then comes back out. And then the last product I'll talk about is the bottom right. This is called an IVX system. It's an IV workflow system that we actually use in our IV room, specifically that goes into our IV hoods in terms of preparing compounded IV medications. And so what this system does, it has a nice touch screen that brings up the order for our technician, gives them the recipe of how to prepare that product. And that platform, you actually put, whether it be a syringe or a bag, on that platform to do 2 things. One, there's a camera up in that higher bar that takes pictures along the way so that our pharmacists, as they're checking product, actually don't physically need to touch the product. They will have pictures. They don't need to be technically in the IV room. I could be sitting here right now checking doses necessarily because of the ability to have this ultimately on the cloud. And then the other thing that platform does, it has a gravimetric scale. So the system knows, did we put actually enough, let's say, potassium into that bag or calcium chloride into that bag? It knows what the specific gravity of the drug was and ultimately what that weight should be. And so again, being that if you make an error around an IV prep, right, the potential consequences of that could be pretty dire. And so we want to ensure the right safety at that point of drug preparation in our IV rooms. So let's talk a little bit about our journey and sort of what we've done as an organization. And I think it really comes down to these 4 different areas. Number one, we needed to know where we stood along sort of the autonomous pharmacy levels. And so we did a gap assessment, and I'll talk about that in a moment in a little bit more detail. Number 2, many of you probably have strategic plans, whether it be in your organization or your departments, but you also sort of need a strategic roadmap around, in my opinion, around technology and automation, right? and it needs to be probably multi-year. So we want to continue to advance in various areas, whether it be inpatient or outpatient in our organization. There's different technologies, there's different software, and they're not necessarily small projects. And so what is our plan year 1, year 2, year 3? Do we have the resources? How do we engage other parts of the institution? If we have to, for instance, put new cabinets in, how are we going to work with nursing? Or if we're going to put some other software together, how are we going to work with our IT department to make sure that we have the server set up and everything, the security checks all done to be able to do that? Number 3 here is developing vendor partnerships. I truly believe that for existing technology, it's really critical to partner with vendors, both at the start, as well as how do you optimize those systems. And as I said at the beginning of my presentation, there's technology that hasn't even been created yet to help us to get to this autonomous pharmacy. And so we have to partner with vendors to develop these technologies for them to understand ultimately how our operation works, where our struggles are, how can we improve med safety. And so we need to think about that. And then the last piece, as I said as well at the beginning, again, you can see the picture, another rendering of a picture here of our 2 new towers, is we have this blank slate of a new institution. Now, this building is not going to be done for probably another 6-7 years, but how can we plan and how can we partner with our vendor to be thinking about how can we do things a little bit differently? What's on our roadmap? What's on their roadmap that we may be thinking about and want to start building and designing as we design sort of the different spaces in our organization? So a good example, just coming back to the strategic plan and the strategic roadmap, is just a very simple example. So we have a meeting every month with Omnicell and a variety of team members, and we go through the different projects that we're working on with them. And we sort of, it can be everything from IVX, which is the IV workflow system, which is fairly well implemented at our institution at this time. We continue to sort of evaluate where we're at, how can we optimize? And so we're in good shape there. We have a green in terms of our status. But there's some other products that are new to the market or coming out. So OC1 is called, or is the short, the abbreviation for Omnicell One. CPM is Central Pharmacy Manager, and obviously XT goes to our cabinets. So OC1 is something that is fairly new in the US, but it's been out for a little bit. And so we wanted to get a better understanding of what are all the different functionalities of those systems. Where do they fit into our system? What's the benefit? What do we need to potentially put this on our roadmap? And so again, we had a presentation to talk a little bit through that. Central Pharmacy Manager is really kind of the overall architecture that a lot of different systems can dock into. It reports up into the cloud. And so this was more of a technical discussion around the architecture of the system. And again, we will continue to talk with Omnicell about moving forward with this. And then finally, XT cabinets. We were replacing 200 cabinets, and we stopped when COVID hit, and we're back in the process. And so just talking with the team about making sure we're good moving forward. But again, these are things that are taking multi-years. These are things we already have in place, as well as new technologies and software that we're talking with them about to learn more and where they potentially fit into the overall roadmap. Now, this is sort of not related to autonomous pharmacy, but other things we're thinking about as an organization. I've talked a little bit about, again, all pharmacists and direct patient care roles, but we're thinking about things like machine learning and artificial intelligence and what is coming to the market that can really be more intelligent than our current systems. We are part of a multi-hospital system, and so we're talking about how do we potentially centralize or standardize our technologies. In the US, there's a lot of new medications, and this is probably the same across the world, across the globe, in terms of precision medicine, gene therapy. These are much more than taking a solution or a liquid out of a vial and putting it in an IV bag. These are much more complex. And so how are we preparing for that as an organization and as a pharmacy department to be able to take those on? And then finally, digital health. So where does digital health play in, again, overall within healthcare, but potentially around medications? And so how are we potentially playing a role in our outpatient facilities? How are we proactively managing patients' care while they're at home to prevent them from being admitted into the hospital? So just a couple other things to be thinking about. So just a little bit about our current state of where we are on the autonomous pharmacy roadmap. You may have seen this before, but this is the different levels of the framework, ultimately with a goal of getting to level 5. And organizations are going to be at all different, probably 1, 2, and 3 at this point. And it's nothing to be ashamed about being not at the highest level, but obviously utilizing this as that framework to move forward. Now I can say MGH right now, we are at a high 2, low 3. The reason why I know that is because we ultimately just took the self-assessment. So Omnicell has a self-assessment around the autonomous pharmacy. It can be found on their website. And you can see the 5 different categories that we're scored in. We have an overall score of 2.9. And as you can see from the 5 different categories, we're doing pretty good on an automation. You saw the examples of the different technologies we do have in place. And clearly we still need to get to 5, but we're in good shape. But what this self-assessment also allows us to do is to look at things like enterprise structure and human activity, where we have the lowest scores, and really what do we need to do to get those raised up? Ultimately, we need to get everything to a 5, but it gives us a sense of where we stand and utilizing this to ultimately make our plan. Now, just to give you a sense, I'm not going to go through this. This is a very busy slide, but just to give you a sense of how the self-assessment scores, so you can see sort of the major factors or the major processes to the left, and then what each of those kind of means from the activities within those different processes. And remember, the autonomous pharmacy is not simply just technology and automation to prepare dispense medications. It's around supply chain, it's around finance, it's around analytics. There are other components to it as well, because we ultimately need to have that closed loop. So we think about level 1, level 2, level 3, and again, that's how we can score. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of background as it relates to that. So let's quickly talk about the different challenges. And I think it's important to be thinking about this, to be as proactive as possible as it relates to how do we get ahead on technology and automation. So I think a lot of the barriers are in these 8 different areas. And these are obviously very broad topics. But in the market right now, there is struggles with standardization and interoperability and data sharing. I think that capital costs, right? We'll talk about that in a little bit more. You have to have the funding, and then the change management. So it's not only the technical side of things, but how are you going to potentially modify your workflow to best optimize those technologies? How are you going to convince your staff that these are good things that we need to be putting in place to make their jobs better, to make our institution safer, more efficient, so on and so forth. As we think about sort of the other different challenges, I'll break this out into 3 different areas: decision making, implementation, overall, and then optimization. So as you think about the different products, right, you're going to have to make a decision. And I think this is ultimately the first step that you need to be considering. So what are the products on the market? As we just talked about in terms of the self-assessment, a gap analysis, where do you have those gaps? And then prioritization, right? Where is the biggest bang for your buck? Where do you need to start first to improve safety, efficiency, whatever it may be to your organization that's most important? But you need to consider funding sources and ultimately using some of these points from a justification to justify that with your institution leadership to say, hey, we need this because it's going to make us safer, or we're going to have better documentation, or unfortunately, we had an event and now this is going to help us through that. Selection obviously is just as important, and there's variety of steps that need to be considered for selection as well. And so engaging the vendor, obviously establishing those partnerships, and who do you think you can have long-term partnerships with? If you can go to site visits of other institutions, you're all welcome to come to Boston and visit us, but also reference checks, just calling your colleagues to say, hey, what has it been like to work with this company, or what has been your experience with this technology? And again, obviously all these other pieces are very critical from a selection standpoint. And then finally, implementation. So what are you going to do in terms of how many products are you going to buy? If this is, not just one item, piece of technology, where are you going to put it? How big are they? Do you have the space to put it? Are you going to pilot it? Or are you going to just do big bang? You're going to do it across the whole institution. Do you have the resources ultimately to build, but also maintain databases? I think where we've struggled as an institution is just the time it takes to build out some of these databases, to create these interfaces. We have to work very closely with our IT group, and sometimes we're not considering, we don't know what we don't know, and so we need to think about that. And then the last piece here I would just say is about redesigning the workflow and sort of how do you engage that staff. And a lot of staff don't want to change their workflow, but you're going to need to tweak it to ultimately make use of the technology as efficiently as possible. So in sort of, coming to the end here a little bit, I want to just kind of talk through, if I had my vision for current state, these are all the different types of technologies that I would potentially have in place. Now, we're not there yet. There's some gaps, and you've seen some of the technologies that we already have in place. But starting in the top left is RFID, or radio frequency identification. As you know, we use barcode technology and scanning of barcodes, but RFID would ultimately rule that out. And so we would have tags, we would have signals being sent to a server, and we would know where all of our products are at all times and how much we had. So that's sort of ultimately where we need to go from ultimately an inventory perspective. Medication carousels as a way to best manage those. There's some new technology that is similar to carousels that actually does the picking for you, both from a restock as well as a picking to load your cabinets, called an XR2. That's some new technology coming on the market. IVX, or the IV workflow system. And then two technologies we didn't talk about earlier is robotics. And so the top right corner is just a general IV drug preparation robotic. And the one on the second row on the left is a chemotherapy robot. Again, another really high risk, not only from an error perspective, but also from a hazardous drug perspective. And then we have the three different cabinets. We have XT cabinets, the controlled substance cabinets, anesthesia workstation. And then the bottom row really ultimately is things that we can't see, right? It's about how is all of this information going up to the cloud that we can easily get the information. It's hopefully better secure than what we have potentially in servers within our institutions. I think inventory management, having just a better look into how we're purchasing drugs, the cost of drugs, how we're utilizing them, and sort of along that same lines is advanced analytics, right? How are we utilizing information to make better decisions in our institution? And I think a lot of time we have the data, but it's really not ultimately useful. And so how do we have better software that can help us make better decisions, whether it be with the carousel or the robot or within our cabinets, to make better decisions, to be more efficient, to be safer, and the like. And then just in sort of closing here, I want to kind of talk about, maybe next steps. And at the beginning, I said, I really want you to take some practical information away from this session that you can go back to your institution and say, hey, I get this. This is what we need to do. Here's kind of the stepwise way to go about it. So I think number one is really about the self-assessment, really determining where your gaps are, and where you have some strengths and where you have some opportunities, and utilizing that ultimately to the second bullet, and how are you establishing your strategic roadmap? If you don't have one, it's really important to start, bring your teams together, brainstorm, really think about prioritization. Where do you have the biggest bang for your buck in your institution? Where do you need to start? Sort of to my last bullet here, where do you really need to start to gain support with hospital administration, or those that make the decisions around the funding, to justify the reasons why you need to do these things and when you need to do them? And then lastly is really starting to speak with vendors, not only from the perspective of what technologies are available and on the market, but what is it like to work with them? Are they good partners? And again, we're going to need to develop some new technologies along the way. And I would encourage you to sort of be a little bit of the guinea pigs along the way to develop those new technologies to ultimately get us to this final goal. So with that, we are at time. Thanks everybody for your attention. And then I'm just going to, it looks like there's a couple questions in the chat, and I'm going to go and try to answer those for you. Okay, so first question is, what is your biggest challenge in convincing C-suite to invest in your vision? So great question. You know, as I just sort of had in my last slide, I think it's important that you really start to make the case in your institution early and often, I guess I would say, in why you need to move forward. I think number one, you need to have the plan of what you're going to do first and second and third, because you need to sort of have your own ducks in a row. But I think, you know, unfortunately, I would say a lot of times there's some unfortunate incidents that happen that push people to purchase technology. But it's really about how do you justify, how do you show some data? If there's a return on investment, even better, right? To be able to show some financials that are associated with it. And I think in some cases, you need to partner with other disciplines in your institution. So let's take our cabinets. We needed to upgrade our cabinets, and there's no secret, we had to buy 200 of them, and it's a couple $1 million to do that. And so we partnered with our chief nurse and some other nurse leaders to say, when it came time for funding, hey, we needed to do this, we needed to upgrade, and here are the reasons why we needed. I think every institution is going to be a little bit different in how they go about the process. But I think, again, having that roadmap, starting early and really understanding what are those touch points for your leaders, what's important to them, and how can you sort of say, well, you know, this implementation touches on 2, 3, 4 of those things. And then the second question I have here, did your own staff buy into the vision, or what do you need to get their buy-in? So that's a great question. And I think sometimes it can be a struggle. And sometimes it can be fairly easy. Let's take our IV workflow system, our IVX system that we implemented actually just this past fall. So this was a technology that actually was going to probably slow down our technicians a little bit because they had to use the technology to take pictures and to weigh the products. But there's going to be a ton of other efficiencies and sort of, you know, selecting drugs that needed to be prepared really more real time. It was going to be much more efficient for our pharmacists. They're going to have more information to make better checks, and there's going to be more checks and balances along the way. So we started early with them and involved many of them in the process as we were actually evaluating different technologies. And we had pretty regular meetings with them to say, here are the reasons why we're doing this. We're doing this to be safer, ultimately, for all of our patients. We know that there's human factors that play in. You know, we're making thousands and thousands of IVs a day. People get tired. They may, you know, the guard, not purposely, but their guard may be put down. And so this technology ultimately is going to catch those types of things. And so they knew the importance of that. They know how many IV preps they make a day. And so I think they got it. But we also worked very closely with them on how that was going to change their workflow and let them be part of that decision-making process, and not just leadership coming in and saying, this is what we're going to do. They've never heard anything about it. And, oh, by the way, we're going live in 2 weeks, right? That's just, people are going to they're going to push back. They're going to get defensive, and we need to go that way. In terms of the larger vision, however, these are things that we have part of our overall strategic plan. We talk to our staff at staff meetings and area specific meetings around where we want to go, what we're doing next, so that they know that there's, this is not just one technology we're implementing and we're done. There's much more, as well as the technologies that we do implement that we're optimizing, that we always want to continue to get better, use new functionality, systems get upgraded. And so we want to continue to get better. So it looks like I don't see any other questions, and I think we're about at time. So I just want to thank again everybody for your time today, your attention, and hopefully you can take some of these strategies back to your organization as you head back home over the next couple of days. Thank you.